Spot on. And the White House is more concerned of whether or not the president can walk in a straight line to a podium. Meanwhile, there's actually big global issues out there that are completely being ignored. Now, a former Obama advisor, Van Jones, has suggested that Vice President Kamala Harris is effectively being positioned as the party's de facto nominee, regardless of President Joe Biden's official status in the race. I mean, talk about desperation. Kamala Harris has been one of the most unelectable people in Democrat history, and yet she's the de facto.
Look, Kamala Harris is a bad politician. I mean, she did not win a single primary vote in the 2020 Democratic Party primary. She was out well before Iowa, which voted first that year in the caucuses. She was explicitly tapped to be the vice president solely for identity politics reasons. And, if that's really the Democrats' best shot, then that says a lot about the current state of their party. But she really is the only viable alternative at this point to Joe Biden for multiple reasons. The one reason is what I just said, is that this is a party in 2022 that selected Ketanji Brown Jackson to be their new Supreme Court justice explicitly because she was a black woman. So the notion that they would somehow skip over Kamala Harris to go pick Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer or anyone who was not a specifically black or maybe Hispanic woman, the notion that they would do that is ludicrous. That's not who this party is. They are an intersectional identity politics worshiping cult to their core in the year 2024. But the second reason why it can't be anyone other than Kamala Harris is because in America, our campaign finance laws are somewhat complicated, but essentially, if you donate to the Biden-Harris campaign, and right now that campaign has over $200 million sitting in its bank accounts, you can't just then transfer that money to a different entity. That money either sits there or it might go back to the donors, or maybe it goes to the DNC, the Democratic National Committee. Frankly, it's actually an open question as to whether that money would even stay there if Joe Biden drops out, because say it's Harris Whitmer or whatever, it's a different entity. So it's legally untested as it is, but if they want any chance of keeping that $200+ million, it would have to be Kamala. But again, the fact that this is the choice that Democrats are facing, I think, says everything you need to know about the current state of their party.
Gee, it speaks volumes, doesn't it? That's incredible to hear. Now, look, Donald Trump looks likely to announce his vice president just before or during the Republican National Convention next week. Who do you think he might go with?
Well, I'll tell you who I think he should go with, and he happens to be one of the front runners. So my answer is basically the same both ways. I think that he should go with J.D. Vance, who is the young, precocious 39-year-old senator from Ohio, and I'll explain to you why. A lot of people, when they start playing the vice presidential sweepstakes game, they start doing a little checklist. Okay, who fits a certain demographic box? That's why you hear a lot of talk about Tim Scott, because he's a black man in the U.S. Senate, or maybe Ben Carson, who was the black former HUD director. And then you see some people talk about, who was in a certain key state? Okay, maybe Glenn Youngkin in Virginia. To me, J.D. Vance is the best pick for at least two very important reasons. One is, if you get down to brass tacks, the way that you win a presidential election in the United States is via the Electoral College. It is a race to 270 electoral votes. Right now, Donald Trump has a commanding lead in essentially what we call the Sun Belt down here. That's Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia, all of the warmer weather states, where it's still sometimes within the margin of error, not always, but where it is still sometimes within the margin of error in the polling is the Rust Belt. So Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan specifically. Trump's going to have to win at least one of those three. Now, he's in good shape right now, frankly, in all three, especially Pennsylvania, but that's really where you want to double down. That happens to be J.D. Vance's core base right there. He's a guy from Ohio who wrote a famous book called Hillbilly Elegy. He speaks to white working class voters in the Rust Belt better than anyone currently on Trump's list. And the other reason why I think he's the best pick right now is because, as I mentioned, he's a very young guy. He's 39 years old. He speaks to the discontent that millennials and Gen Z have to the boomers who have spent like drunken sailors, who have been trying to march all around the world, invading countries to no avail and so forth. And at a time when Democrats are currently hemorrhaging youth support as it is, I think J.D. Vance can only solidify that exodus of young voters from the Democrats to the Republican Party.
Well, it's going to be very interesting. We'll be watching that announcement very closely. Now, just before we let you go, woke activist groups are opposing a sex trafficking bill in California, complaining that it will, would you believe it, harm the LGBTQ community and people of colour. Listen to this.
Studies have shown that LGBTQ people, particularly gay and transgendered individuals, are more likely to be charged with sex offences compared to their heterosexual counterparts. For instance, LGBTQ individuals are 9 times more likely to be charged with sodomy. Measures like SB 1414 lead to higher rates of incarceration, longer sentences, and increased difficulties in finding housing and employment.
I mean, we can hardly be surprised, Josh, that this is a sort of response we get from the woke activists. What on earth is going on here?
So, look, I mean, if you're trying to pass a bill that is a child safety bill, probably the number one thing that is happening in America and in all Western nations across the world, for that matter, that is the antithesis of child safety is genital mutilation and chemical castration that comes about via so-called gender affirming care, which is currently one of the greatest things that the LGBT rainbow movement has going for it. I mean, they very much adore these so-called gender affirming surgeries. Again, I refer to it usually as chemical castration or genital mutilation. So it kind of just goes without saying that if you are part of this woke LGBT mafia, then you are going to oppose a bill in the name of child safety. But, you know, the silver lining is when I see a story like this, that the people who come out in opposition to a common sense legislation like this, they're only ultimately making a fool of themselves. And if you are kind of a sensible, moderate, middle of the road person out there still trying to decide where to put your political loyalties, you see a video like that and you say, wow, I want nothing to do with them.
You're spot on. I think many people can share that view. Josh Hammer, thank you for joining us.